February 1942, as the Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter steamed through the night in the Badung Strait. The collective tension among the crew manifested in the creaks and murmurs of the ship. In the distance, on the horizon, some pointed to the looming silhouettes of Japanese destroyers Asashio and Oshio. A sailor's heartbeat quickened, sensing the gravity of the impending clash. Orders were barked and guns readied. The vessel sailed headlong into the unknown as the Battle of the Badung Strait was about to break out. In the early 20th century, Japan rapidly developed, adopting new technologies for increased productivity and a stronger global position. Modeling its army and navy after Europe, Japan faced rising tensions with European nations and embarked on the conquest of Southeast Asia. The Empire of the Rising Sun annexed territories including Formosa, Korea, and parts of Manchuria. With Japan's economic growth came increased trade with the Dutch East Indies. A third of goods imported by the Dutch East Indies from Japan were used. Japan had made various attempts to secure more resources from the Dutch East Indies, leading to criticism from the Dutch, suspecting territorial expansion. Measures such as tariffs and intelligence systems were implemented in 1933, making Japan more impatient in its attempts to increase influence over the archipelago. The Dutch had seized the Dutch East Indies through a prolonged process starting in the late 16th century. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, spearheaded their colonization efforts, using military force, alliances with local rulers, and monopolistic trade policies. By the 18th century, the Dutch dominated the spice trade, employing a divide-and-conquer strategy among indigenous kingdoms. Despite brief British control during the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch regained their holdings through the 1814 treaty. The Netherlands clung to neutrality, but in May 1940, Germany invaded the country. The Dutch government fled to London, setting up a government in exile. That evening, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Tjaarda van Starkenborg, was informed of the German invasion of the Netherlands. From now on, they were on their own, as there were barely any military reinforcements and goods from Europe available. Facing an impending oil shortage, Japan sought to secure the East Indies oil supply. President of the United States Franklin Delano Roosevelt put an embargo on oil exports to Japan. This led to Japan losing 93% of its oil, as it grew increasingly isolated. Fearing a US declaration of war if Japan seized the East Indies, the Japanese orchestrated the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. War was now inevitable. The East Indies emerged as a crucial target for Japan due to its abundant resources, particularly rubber plantations and oil fields. The colony was the world's fourth largest oil exporter, making it strategically important for Japan, which lacked native oil sources. The Dutch government in the East Indies, aware of Japan's intentions, declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941. However, Japan, keen on preventing the Dutch from destroying oil installations prematurely, did not reciprocate until January 11th. The ensuing campaign involved General Hisashi Terauchi's Southern Expeditionary Army Group, targeting key locations like Borneo and initiating a three-pronged assault on the East Indies to capture vital oil resources. On December 17th, Japanese troops landed in Miri, a key oil production center in northern Sarawak, supported by a warship, aircraft carrier, 3 cruisers, and 4 destroyers. Japan continued the offensive with air raids on crucial positions, gaining air superiority. Landings occurred at various locations between December 15th, 1941, and January 19th, 1942. The plan was to expand southward, seizing oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies. The Eastern, Center, and Western forces aimed to conquer strategic points, with the Eastern force advancing towards Jolo, Davao City, Celebes, Ambon, and Timor. The Center force targeted Tarakan and Balikpapan, while the Western force attacked Palembang's oil refineries and airfields. The coordinated defense against Japan led to the formation of the American-British-Dutch-Australian Command at Surabaya. Admiral Thomas Hart was appointed as commander of the Navy. Despite collaborative efforts, differing strategies among English, Dutch, American, and Australian commanders complicated the joint defense. English priorities focused on safeguarding Singapore and the eastern entrances to the Indian Ocean. Americans and Australians were cautious about advancing into Southwest Asia, and the Dutch emphasized defending Java and Sumatra as crucial points. Facing superior Japanese numbers, the naval forces included ships from the US Asiatic Fleet, British, Australian, and Dutch units. The Japanese, with significant naval and air power, swiftly advanced through the region, capturing key locations like Tarakan, using it as a forward airbase to capture Balikpapan a week later. On February 15th, the Japanese captured Singapore, throwing command into serious disorganization. Hart left Java for Ceylon, leaving Vice Admiral Conrad Helfrich in charge of the remnants of Abda's fleet. The surface fleet fell under the command of Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. Admiral Doorman, 52 years old, was a seasoned Dutch naval officer with a background in aviation. Since 1940, he commanded the Dutch fleet forces in the East Indies. The island of Bali became a linchpin in the region. Its proximity to Java and its vital airfield Denpasar made it a likely target for the rapidly advancing Japanese. As Japanese forces had gained control over airfields in Balikpapan, they also conquered parts of Celebes, Dutch Borneo, and by February they landed on Sumatra, fostering a revolt in Aceh. Despite some resistance, the majority of Allied naval and land forces succumbed to the Japanese onslaught within 2 months. By mid-February 1942, Bali indeed became a key target for Japan to ensure success in the final offensive on Java. Despite offering little to Japan's development, Bali's occupation was deemed essential for its strategic advantages in maintaining air superiority and controlling vital straits. In preparation for the invasion of Bali, the Japanese concentrated a naval force in Makassar on February 17th, with troop transport ships and destroyers led by Rear Admiral Kyuji Kubo. The minimal resistance and intact airfield allowed Japan to claim a strategic victory. Simultaneously, intelligence indicated Japanese movements, with sightings off Kendari and Ambon, suggesting an invasion force heading to Bali and a potential threat to Timor. Helfrich and Doorman devised a plan to concentrate Allied forces in the east. De Ruyter, Java, Piet Hein, Kortenaer, Ford, and Pope would take an Indian Ocean route to Cilacap, while Tromp and American destroyers from Ratai Bay would head to Surabaya via the Java Sea. Misfortune cast its shadow upon the fleet even as it departed the harbour. The Dutch destroyer Kortenaer temporarily lost control of its rudder, grounding itself on one of the Channel shores. Doorman had no choice but to press forward with the mission, leaving the incapacitated vessel behind. Recognizing their vulnerable position, Japanese Commander Kubo issued orders to expedite the operation. The main force departed for Makassar that evening. Only the transport Sasago Maru and the destroyers Asashio and Oshio remained, tasked with collecting the remaining Daihatsu disembarkation launches used in the Bali attack. The initial Allied squadron, led by light cruisers De Ruyter and Java, was followed by Piet Hein at 5,500 yards, with the 2 US destroyers further behind. At 11 p.m., within the confines of the strait, the Java sighted 3 Japanese ships to port, the Sasago Maru, Asashio, and Oshio, preparing to depart. Java promptly fired star shells to enhance visibility and engaged Asashio at point-blank range, a mere 2,200 yards away. In response, the Japanese destroyers left the transport and turned on their searchlights to look for their adversary. De Ruyter, with its artillery trained to portside, took a moment to open fire, but eventually unleashed its firepower on Oshio. The Japanese destroyers, caught off guard, moved eastward against the Dutch cruisers. Sensing Asashio and Oshio's intent to cross their T, the Dutch cruisers altered course to the northeast in an attempt to clear the area, yet their efforts proved futile. Despite firing only a handful of salvos, Each Dutch cruiser claimed numerous hits on the enemy destroyers. As the Japanese ships continued their mission seemingly undamaged, Asashio managed to land one 5-inch projectile on Java, inflicting minimal damage. The cruisers hastily retreated at high speed while the Japanese destroyers lost contact and steamed southeast. Trailing the Dutch light cruisers and seeing them engaging the Japanese, Piet Hein launched 3 torpedoes at Sasago Maru and opened fire with its 4.7-inch artillery on the same target. However, now free from the cruiser's fire, Asashio and Oshio closed in on the Piet Hein, retaliating with torpedoes and gunfire. Faced with this onslaught, Piet Hein turned to starboard in a southeast course, launching 2 torpedoes at Asashio. Both missed. Simultaneously firing its artillery and deploying a smokescreen, Piet Hein attempted to conceal itself from the relentless Japanese assault. Nevertheless, Asashio, at a close distance, struck Piet Hein with 2 5-inch shells, one on the second mast platform, igniting a significant fire, and the other in the second boiler room. Piet Hein, deprived of propulsion, came to a halt. One of Asashio's long-lance torpedoes struck the port side, causing the ship to sink almost immediately. 149 of its crew wouldn't survive to tell the tale. The smoke screens created by Piet Hein shielded Asashio and Oshio from the approaching American destroyers. They fired their port-side torpedoes against Sasago Maru. These missed their target. Passing through Piet Hein's smokescreen, the American vessels spotted Asashio, which promptly opened fire on the John D. Ford. Despite retaliating with artillery and launching 5 torpedoes from the Pope, the Allied ships were compelled to retreat southeast, deploying another smokescreen without sustaining any damage or inflicting harm on the enemy. Asashio and Oshio lost visual contact with the American ships, briefly exchanging artillery salvos under the misconception that they were attacking other Allied vessels. Emerging unscathed, they soon realized their error and rejoined to defend and assist the Sasago Maru. Asashio and Oshio, having attended to Sasago Maru, reloaded their torpedo tubes, anticipating a second Allied attack that loomed on the horizon. Upon learning of the Allied ship sighting in the Badung Strait, Admiral Kubo redirected the Arashio and Michishio to leave their transport to support the other 2 destroyers. A second Allied naval formation, departing from Surabaya, aimed to complement the initial strike force, navigating the Bali Strait and surrounding the south part of Bali. The force entered the Badung Strait by 1 a.m. led by the Stuart, with the Parrot, Pillsbury, and John D. Edwards. The Allied ships were unaware of the circumstances surrounding the first strike force. In the ensuing chaotic engagement with Japanese destroyers Asashio and Oshio, Allied torpedoes failed to hit, leading to a retreat to the northeast. At 2:45 a.m., Stuart detected 2 Japanese ships, resulting in an opportunity for the Allies to fire at Michishio and Arashio. Although all Allied torpedoes missed, Michishio sustained significant damage from the shelling. The Allies retreated to Java's main naval base, Cilacap, and the American destroyer Stuart, damaged in the engagement, ended up capsizing in a floating dry dock. The Japanese later captured Stuart and repurposed it as a patrol ship for the remainder of the war. Piet Hein's fate raised questions, particularly regarding the reasons for its abrupt stop. Officially, Asashio was credited with the hit, but speculation persists that the Dutch ship may have been an accidental target of American destroyers in the vicinity. Possibly momentarily losing contact with Piet Hein, the American destroyers spotted an unknown destroyer moving in the opposite direction, interpreting it as an enemy ship and opening fire before realizing their mistake, potentially too late. The attribution of damages and the sinking of Piet Hein were officially assigned to Asashio, overlooking any alternative explanations. Overall, the Battle of the Badung Strait proved a strategic, material, and tactical defeat for the Allies, losing the island of Bali and facing subsequent challenges in the Java campaign due to the loss of ships and Japanese aerial dominance. The Allies, relying on artillery, underestimated the effectiveness of Japanese torpedoes and lacked proficiency in night fighting, contributing to their overall failure in the operation. Within a week, Dorman would again meet a Japanese fleet, and this time it would be a battle for survival. On an unusually warm February afternoon in 1942, a convoy of the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed through the Java Sea. Suddenly, Nachi's scout plane relayed a worrying message. 2 columns of an Allied striking force were spotted nearby. As sailors donned working uniforms and officers adorned white dress attire, they rushed to their stations. Seeking solace in ship shrines, they clasped hachimaki headbands as rising sun battle ensigns fluttered in the wind. Every officer and sailor understood the danger of an advancing hostile fleet. In a matter of minutes, the decisive battle of the Java Sea would break out. In early 1942, Japan successfully steamrolled through the Pacific theater. After conquering Singapore and vital cities of the Dutch East Indies, the main island of Java became the next target. The Allied Joint Command faced challenges such as insufficient forces and communication difficulties. After the British and American commanders left for Ceylon, Dutch Admiral Conrad Helfrich took charge. Dutch troops, especially the King's Netherlands Indies Legion, were experienced, and their navy had modern destroyers and submarines. The flagship De Ruyter, designed specifically for East Indies service, had advanced weaponry. Key vessels of the combined command included USS Houston, HMS Exeter, light cruisers from Britain, Australia, and the US, along with destroyers. Challenges included older British light cruisers being withdrawn, shortages, and damage. Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman commanded the surface naval forces, dealing with cumbersome communication methods. On February 18th, as the Japanese advanced onto Bali, Admiral Dorman led a night strike on Japanese vessels in Badung Strait. However, chaos ensued, and exchanges of fire resulted in minimal damage. Additionally, the Dutch destroyer Piet Hein was lost. The Allies retreated to Java's main naval base, Cilacap, and the American destroyer Stuart, damaged in the engagement, ended up capsizing in a floating dry dock. As the Allies prepared for the next engagement, they realized their fleet could hardly face the Japanese. Only 4 1920s-era destroyers, Ford, Edwards, Alden, and Paul Jones, were available, limiting their firepower in rough seas. The heavy cruiser, USS Houston, had suffered damage during an air raid, rendering its damaged turret useless. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces were approaching Java with a large fleet. 2 columns of 56 transports, guarded by heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and a light aircraft carrier, advanced from the west, while another force with 41 transports, heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and destroyers approached the east. In total, these transports held 2 divisions and the headquarters of Japan's 16th Army. Admiral Takeo Takagi was tasked with protecting these convoys with a significant naval force. Smaller convoys sailed north and south of Java, screening the ocean and preventing Allied submarines from interfering. Takagi commanded a strong combat group comprising the Myoko-class heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro, the Sendai-class light cruisers Jintsu and Naka, and 14 destroyers. Despite favorable weather and visibility, Allied submarines failed to pose a threat as their torpedoes were malfunctioning. Though unable to attack, American submarines reported on Japanese movements, warning Helfrich. With this intelligence, Helfrich sent Dorman and an Allied squadron to depart from Batavia to Surabaya. Despite problems like the disabled gun turret on the USS Houston and a leaking boiler on the Dutch destroyer Kortenaya, the fleet departed. On February 26th, Admiral Dorman's fleet sailed from Surabaya, unable to find the Japanese. Helfrich received intelligence the Japanese were now to Dorman's northwest. He urged Dorman to set sail again the following day to intercept the Japanese convoy. Despite personnel exhaustion, the force headed north, with Dorman signaling his ships to follow and intercept the enemy unit. Takagi, receiving intelligence an Allied fleet may be poised to intercept him, dispatched a float plane while sending the majority of the convoy to the west, while taking his battleships to confront Dorman's ships. The striking force was organized into two columns, led by Dorman on De Ruyter. The first column included Exeter, Houston, Perth, and Java, with British destroyers preceding De Ruyter as a screening force. Meanwhile, American and Dutch destroyers formed a separate column at the cruiser's rear and port quarter, hindered by older engines and weaker armor. While Dorman's ships ventured north, the Japanese had spotted their vessels approaching. They closely monitored their movements. Nachi's scout plane reported the enemy's direction and speed to its commander. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's light cruiser Jintsu led 8 destroyers, followed by Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura's flotilla, and the heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro at the rear. At 4:15 p.m., Electra identified the Japanese cruisers Jintsu and Amatsukaze. The ensuing engagement saw both sides unleashing broadsides from a distance of 28,000 yards, with a combined arsenal of 20 8-inch guns. Communication challenges arose as Dorman had not yet issued the command to open fire, according to Royal Navy protocol, leading to some ships holding fire. The initial Japanese shells fell short, providing the Allied convoy time to organize. Dorman then ordered a course change and positioned British destroyers for a torpedo strike. Simultaneously, he sought air support from Surabaya, but no bombers arrived. Finally, Dorman gave the order, and the Allied heavy cruisers, notably Houston with crimson-dyed shells, initiated a fierce exchange. Jintsu aimed directly at Electra, initiating a fierce exchange of fire. Perth, positioned at the rear of the Allied line, joined the barrage after Electra and Jupiter. Despite 8 intense minutes, neither side scored hits. At 4:31 p.m., a Japanese 8-inch shell struck De Ruyter, but it failed to detonate. Dorman altered course, aligning both columns for the light cruisers to engage. The Japanese, led by Nishimura on Naka, unleashed 43 Long Lance torpedoes. A malfunction in Houston's forward main gun director disrupted gunnery control. On the 5th salvo, the crew faced the near-impossible task of loading and ramming the breach by hand, maintaining pace with the other turret for 65 salvos until repairs were completed. Exeter finally achieved a straddle after a dozen salvos, creating anticipation among the crew, although initial excitement over perceived damage turned out to be unfounded. Exeter faced misfortune as a shell penetrated its gun shield at 5:07 p.m., causing casualties and severe damage to boilers. The vessel's speed significantly dropped, and damage control efforts were impeded by intense heat. With 6 out of 8 boilers inoperable, Exeter's electrical power failed. Captain Gordon altered course to avoid a collision, but communication breakdowns ensued. The confusion led to a disorganized Allied fleet, with destroyers following Exeter, assuming they missed a signal to steer to port. This led to Dorman's flagship De Ruyter advancing on its own against the Japanese line. Realizing the danger, Dorman ordered an increase in speed and a turn to port, while destroyers deployed smokescreens to conceal disarray. Exploiting the chaos, the Japanese closed in. At 5:27, Tanaka issued the order to open fire, with over 90 torpedoes launched in under 30 minutes. The Japanese salvo found its mark, striking the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer, which violently split into 2 sections and sank rapidly. Despite the Japanese launching over 90 torpedoes with only 1 hit, the Allies struggled to comprehend the torpedoes' long-range capabilities. Speculation about Japanese submarines arose. In response, Dorman devised a plan to protect the damaged Exeter, directing a strategic retreat enveloped in a smokescreen. Recognizing the need for cover, Dorman directed his 3 British destroyers, Electra, Encounter, and Jupiter, to execute attacks before rendezvousing with the Dutch destroyer Vita de With to escort Exeter to Surabaya. Electra faced a fierce assault from Jintsu and accompanying destroyers. Despite Electra firing torpedoes in an attempt to retaliate, Jintsu continued its assault. Electra's turrets were incapacitated. A fire ignited, obstructing ammunition supply to turrets, and the ship's auxiliary boats were damaged. The ship became inoperable. Commander Cecil Wakeford May reluctantly issued the order to abandon ship as it rapidly descended to the depths. Of the 173 men on board, 54 would survive. Commander May refused to leave the ship and descended with her. Electra's sacrifice, while unable to prevent Exeter's damage, did score a single hit on Jintsu. This granted Encounter and Jupiter the opportunity to emerge from the smoke, launching torpedoes at the Japanese. Encounter skillfully maneuvered, launching torpedoes before Jupiter and Witte de With joined the effort. However, Witte de With suffered damage during the maneuver, with a loose depth charge exploding and shaking the ship. Facing the loss of Electra and Cotonou, Doorman began reorganizing his dwindling fleet. During their retreat, the heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro seized the opportunity to close in and target the struggling column. Finally, at sunset, as communication faltered and signal lights were destroyed, both Allied and Japanese forces altered course in opposite directions, marking a temporary pause in the combat. Initially, Doorman's ships sailed to the southeast, but within half an hour, Doorman ordered his ships to sail to the northwest to meet the Japanese ships once again. Doorman's forces, now reduced, faced the challenge of engaging the enemy with limited destroyers and supplies. During the brief lull, Takagi seized the opportunity to recover his 5 seaplanes. This maneuver, however, rendered his ships nearly immobile when Doorman's force re-emerged on the scene. Meanwhile, Exeter and her escorts steamed towards Surabaya. The Japanese did not expect the Allied fleet to return. In response to skepticism on Nachi's bridge, Commander Ishikawa angrily confirmed the approaching enemy ships. Takagi, caught off guard, took 3 crucial minutes to order his crew back to action stations. As the engagement resumed, Jintsu's flare illuminated it as a target, prompting Perth and Houston to open fire. But their shells fell short. American Commander Binford led his destroyers towards the Japanese cruisers, Nachi and Haguro. Binford's destroyers launched their torpedo attack, but all torpedoes missed. Suffering heavy fire, Binford initially steered towards Doorman, who was sailing east, in an attempt to reach safety. The distance between them and the Japanese increased. Then, he received a confusing signal to follow, implying a risky attack. The Allied force changed course. Binford's 4 American destroyers struggled to keep pace. Binford voiced his reluctance to plunge after Doorman, noting, "I'm not going in there after Doorman. That Dutchman has more guts than brains." Opting to head for Surabaya for refueling and ammunition reload, Binford, unable to reach Doorman directly, radioed shore bases to relay the message to Doorman. However, these did not reach the Dutch admiral, as he sailed on, oblivious to the detachment of 4 destroyers leaving the line. The tranquility of the night was shattered at 9:25 p.m. by a colossal explosion. Jupiter, at the tail of Doorman's column, struck a Dutch mine. Of its crew, 84 died, 97 captured by the Japanese, and 83 were rescued by the Allies. Learning of Jupiter's sinking, Doorman altered course north. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that both sides spotted each other again. Nachi and Haguro headed south, while De Ruyter, Perth, Houston, and Java moved north. Bright moonlight bathed the battlefield as both sides opened fire at extreme range, neither side scoring direct hits. At 11:22 p.m., Nachi launched 8 torpedoes, and Haguro unleashed 4 at the Allied column. One found its mark on De Ruyter, triggering an explosion that engulfed the flagship's stern in a sea of flame. The pyrotechnics locker erupted, sending flares and rockets soaring into the night sky. Perth, observing the calamity unfold, turned to starboard to avert a collision with the flagship. Houston also took evasive action. Then another Japanese torpedo struck Java, setting off a massive fire. Perth's crew could feel the heat as Java came to a halt, tilting almost vertically. Captain Philip van Stralen ordered the abandonment of the ship, but of the 528 men on board, just 19 survived. The distinctive superstructure of De Ruyter disappeared, marking the final cataclysmic moments of the cruiser. The detonation triggered the explosive discharge of the ship's 40mm anti-aircraft ammunition. As De Ruyter descended into the depths of the Java Sea, Admiral Carroll Dorman transmitted one last signal, instructing all ships not to linger but to leave survivors and make their way to Batavia. With this, Admiral Carroll Dorman and 344 officers and men of the Royal Netherlands Navy joined the depths of the Java Sea. Recognizing the dire situation on the Perth, Captain Waller, now the senior officer present afloat, ordered the Perth and Houston to disengage, execute a feint southeast, and then steam at high speed to Batavia for refueling, rearming, and further orders. In total, the Allies lost 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and suffered significant damage to multiple ships. Over 2,300 sailors were killed. In contrast, the Japanese suffered damage to just 1 destroyer, with 36 sailors killed. The Battle of the Java Sea was over. The road for Japan lay open to invade the island. Dorman's sacrifice had not been enough. The battle marked the near annihilation of the Allied fleet in the region. This pivotal moment would herald the beginning of a dark chapter as Japanese land forces invaded Java. The Japanese now controlled vital resources, including the food-producing region of Java and the 4th largest oil-producing area in the world. For the next several years, Japan would be the dominant force in the region, as the war in the Pacific was far from over. It is an early morning, February 27, 1942. Amidst the waves charting their course towards Java to reinforce the Allied powers holding off the Japanese, the USS Edsall, Whipple, and the United States' first aircraft carrier ever built, USS Langley, sailed north. Just after 9 a.m., a lookout spotted enemy aircraft, prompting Langley to request fighter cover, which was unavailable. As the Japanese patrol plane disappeared in the distance, the ship's crew saw the sky turn dark as silhouettes of over a dozen Mitsubishi Zeros appeared on the horizon. The early months of 1942 saw the Allied forces stretched thin across vast territories. The Japanese adopted a piecemeal strategy to secure key positions in the Dutch East Indies and beyond. Singapore fell to the Japanese on February 15th, while Sumatra, Bali, and Timor also came under Japanese control. In January, ABDICOM, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, was activated under the command of Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, with Admiral Hart leading the naval component. The campaign intensified with Japanese bombings in Manila, prompting the entire fleet's relocation southward. Submarines maintained patrols, but major naval activity ceased as the American Navy retreated. Japanese air power proved decisive in driving the Allies from Manila and jeopardizing Surabaya and Port Darwin. Despite efforts to counter Japanese air superiority, the Allies struggled with insufficient fighter aircraft. The logistical challenges of reinforcing Java with aircraft from Australia proved daunting, with many planes lost in transit. The Japanese advanced methodically, seizing key points in Borneo and Celebes. In Borneo, their overland advances posed a threat to Java and Sumatra, As the Japanese consolidated control over strategic locations, Allied efforts to halt their advances encountered logistical and tactical hurdles. A multinational fleet under Dutch Rear Admiral Doorman was formed in response. As the Japanese tightened their grip, the need for a unified Allied response grew apparent. In mid-February, heavy bombing of Bali signaled the next target for Japanese forces. Japanese forces landing on Bali's southeast coast on February 18th spurred a night raid planned by Admiral Doorman involving cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats. Despite losing a Dutch destroyer and later scuttling a US one, it did briefly halt the Japanese advance. The dissolution of the Allied Supreme Command followed, with General Wavell leaving Java on February 25th, marking the end of coordinated defense efforts. Dutch officers took over defense operations. All Allied officers were redirected to report to Vice Admiral Conrad Helfrich, who now became the chief of the Allied Naval Command in Java. Despite the dire situation in Java, there was a glimmer of hope that the island could be defended if enough fighter planes could be secured. On February 22nd, a convoy carrying 59 planes, including 32 assembled Curtiss P-40E Warhawks on the USS Langley and 27 P-40s on the Sea Witch, set sail from Fremantle, Australia to Ceylon. Helfrich sent orders to redirect the Langley and Sea Witch to Java. Though unknown why, Langley departed from the convoy much earlier than Sea Witch. The USS Langley was the first US Navy aircraft carrier. In 1920, it was converted from the USS Jupiter. It was 165 meters in length, a beam of around 20 meters, and a displacement of approximately 10,400 metric tons, cruising at a speed of about 15 knots. Led by Commander Kenneth Whiting, Langley's transformation showcased innovative feats like a turbo-electric power plant. Commissioned in 1922, Langley spearheaded naval aviation experimentation, contributing to dive bombing techniques and paving the way for future aircraft carriers. In the late 1930s, it underwent a transformation as newer aircraft carriers rendered her obsolete. Its dimensions became modest. In contrast, the USS Lexington, Ranger, Yorktown, and Enterprise, commissioned between 1927 and 1938, epitomized the evolution of carrier technology. Their imposing lengths ranged from around 234 to 271 meters, with beams expanding to 33 to 35 meters and displacement soaring to 18,000 to 30,000 metric tons. Remarkably, their speeds surged to approximately 29 to 33 knots. Converted into a seaplane tender at Mare Island Yard, Langley was refitted to accommodate consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats, accepting a supporting role. In early February 1942, USS Langley was tasked with a crucial mission, delivering much-needed fighter aircraft to Ceylon. Laden with 32 P-40Es and manned by inexperienced pilots, Langley set sail from Fremantle, Australia, accompanied by the freighter Sea Witch carrying additional planes. Helfrich's message to divert towards Java reached Langley as it departed Fremantle. The pressing need for fighters meant they embarked on the journey unescorted due to urgency. However, delays plagued the voyage. Confusion over escort arrangements and mechanical issues slowed progress. Approximately 200 kilometers away from Chilatjap, the Langley was joined by the US destroyers Edsall and Whipple. On the morning of February 27th, enemy aircraft were spotted. As Japanese patrol planes identified the convoy, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet prepared their attack. At 9 a.m., a lookout aboard the Edsall spotted a hostile aircraft. This patrol plane, part of the Japanese 11th Air Fleet, quickly relayed the convoy's information to the nearby Japanese aircraft carriers and shore bases. McConnell immediately radioed air bases on Java's southern coast, requesting aerial support. However, he was informed no aircraft could be spared on such short notice. At 11:40 a.m., the skies darkened as dozens of Mitsubishi Betty bombers approached. Aboard the Edsall, Whipple and Langley, troops took their positions at anti-aircraft guns, waiting for the order to open fire. A vanguard of 9 Bettys veered towards the American vessels, positioning themselves for a devastating assault from the rear. Before they unleashed their fury, a second formation of 7 bombers emerged, soaring at an altitude of 15,000 feet beyond the effective reach of Langley's defensive guns. Undeterred by the impossibility of retaliation, Commander McConnell issued the order to fire, the American shells futilely exploding below the enemy's aircraft. With eerie precision, the Japanese bombers descended upon their targets, treating their assault as little more than a routine exercise. At precisely 11:54 a.m., as the sun hung high overhead, the Japanese planes released their deadly payloads. Swift action was imperative. With nerves of steel, McConnell ordered a hard right rudder, a desperate maneuver aimed at dodging the impending catastrophe. The aged hull groaned under the strain as 2 explosions, hitting the water close by the ship, rocked the vessel. The impact was severe. Riveted seams strained against the force, water seeping into the engine room, threatening to cripple Langley's electric propulsion system. Amidst the chaos, the efforts of the damage control teams proved crucial. They fought against the relentless deluge as the first wave of attacks was over. Not a single bomb had hit the vessel. Undeterred by their initial failure, the flight leader of the 9 Bettys opted for a second approach. At 12:12 p.m., as the tension aboard Langley mounted, the Japanese bombers adjusted their tactics to counter McConnell's evasive maneuvers. The first bomb struck perilously close, landing a mere 4 feet from the starboard side on the main deck, where the ship's boats lay in wait. The force of the explosion ripped open a 10-foot chasm, severing communication lines and disrupting steering control. Meanwhile, the second bomb pierced the port side of the elevator, situated on the forward part of the battered flight deck. A third bomb followed suit, striking dangerously close to the port airplane elevator, igniting a blaze that engulfed multiple P-40 aircraft. As flames licked at the deck, a fourth bomb landed further aft on the port side, decimating planes and wreaking havoc among the sailors stationed topside. Japanese fighters added to the carnage, strafing Langley's exposed decks. Amidst the inferno, McConnell and his crew fought back, continuously firing the machine guns. The second wave of attacks was over. It was not looking good as fuel reserves dwindled and many aircraft were damaged. Sailors were killed and the ship listed heavily to port. In a desperate bid to salvage what remained, damaged P-40s were cast overboard and counter-flooding measures were implemented. Due to the water damage, Langley's electric motors faltered. Faced with the grim prospects and unwillingness to jeopardize the safety of escorting destroyers, McConnell made the agonizing decision to abandon ship. The Whipple and Edsall extended a lifeline, rescuing as many sailors as they could, and so, amidst the smoke and flames, the once proud Langley succumbed to the ocean. To prevent the Japanese from seizing the listing Langley, Whittle fired several 4-inch shells and Edsall launched torpedoes, scuttling the vessel. In total, only 16 sailors aboard the Langley died. However, losing their first aircraft carrier was a serious hit to US morale. Langley's grave is located roughly 120 kilometers south of Tjilatjap. Learning of Langley's sinking, the tanker USS Pecos en route to Ceylon altered course to assist in the rescue operation. Ultimately, the survivors were transferred to Pecos from the destroyers for further assistance. En route to Fremantle, the Pecos arrived at Christmas Island to transfer survivors from the Langley. However, Japanese dive bombers initiated a relentless 3-hour attack. The sustained assault caused significant damage, resulting in fires, a severe list, and structural damage. The Pecos sank at 15:48, with survivors fleeing to lifeboats and rafts amid strafing from Japanese planes. The distress signal was picked up by the destroyer Whipple, which swiftly arrived at the scene, rescuing 220 survivors from the water amidst concerns of submarine activity. Carrying a total of over 670 crew members, this only saw 220 survivors. The Sea Witch did manage to reach Tjilatjap undetected. She delivered her Warhawk aircraft before returning to Australia undetected. However, the Japanese rapidly advanced. During the night of February 27th, a Japanese fleet destroyed an Allied fleet under the command of Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. In a twist of irony, the US Army on Java decided to destroy all delivered aircraft to prevent capture. as they abandoned Java altogether. By March 8th, Cilacap was overrun by the Japanese, marking the capture of Java entirely. Japan now dominated the Pacific, as the bloody war had only just begun. It is February 1942. In a rapid military campaign, the Japanese Empire overwhelmed large parts in Asia, including the Dutch East Indies. After 2 disastrous naval battles, the combined Allied fleet decided to abandon its headquarters in the region and seek refuge elsewhere. Among the ships leaving the region were famous USS Houston and HMAS Perth, their vessels battered from previous engagements, and their crews exhausted, but relieved they were close to leaving the violent waters. As the ships navigated the Sunda Strait, the cruisers were alarmed when a lookout on Perth spotted an unidentified ship against the horizon. The unknown ship responded incorrectly, prompting Captain Hector Waller to recognize the threat and order general quarters. In fact, this Japanese destroyer escorted a large convoy of transports, and it wasn't alone. The destroyer Harukaze shot a red flare to alert its fleet. The Allies, now on high alert, were about to face battle once again. Following the fall of Singapore to the Japanese on February 14, 1942, Allied forces defending the Dutch East Indies struggled against a strong Japanese offensive. The Japanese employed aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, and well-trained special naval landing forces in a coordinated assault. Abda's defences, led by poorly coordinated contingents from Britain, the United States, Australia, and the Netherlands, faced difficulties under the command of Field Marshal Lord Archibald Wavell. Commander Wavell departed for Ceylon, anticipating the fall of the Dutch East Indies. Conrad Helfrich took over command of the Allied forces in the region. Despite strong resistance, the Allies could not withstand the Japanese forces. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman's flagship was sunk in the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, leading to the dissolution of the multinational command. With heavy cruisers damaged and key leaders killed, the senior British and American admirals decided to pull their ships out. The heavy cruisers, particularly HMS Exeter and USS Houston, faced challenges with severe damage and shortages, including burned-out gun turrets and ammunition shortages. The deteriorating condition of the warships, once prestigious vessels, was worrisome. Its crews were not looking any better. Exhausted and sleep-deprived, they had not rested for 30 hours, constantly defending against air and sea attacks. Captain Albert Rooks had not changed his uniform in 3 days. Aboard the Leander-class light cruiser Perth, conditions were much the same. Both vessels had to evacuate Java to avoid the Japanese invasion heading for Australia. However, the need to navigate with limited supplies did not bode well for their journey. Javanese fuel quality did not meet naval standards, causing tank issues. Despite limited ammunition, the ships aimed to escape the Japanese threat by heading west through the Sunda Strait at night, refueling on Java's south shore and making a high-speed run to Australia, capitalizing on the Japanese lack of radar. Despite the weariness and challenges faced by the crews of USS Houston and HMAS Perth, the news of their withdrawal to Australia lifted their spirits. Captain Hector Waller was the de facto senior officer for the journey. Many expressed relief and optimism at the prospect of leaving the perilous situation in the Java Sea. On February 28th at 6:30 p.m., the 2 cruisers left the harbour, cautiously avoiding Dutch mines. Once clear, they increased speed to 22 knots, heading west towards the Sunda Strait. The exhausted crews, respecting their skipper, manned their stations as the ships moved into the dusk under a clear sky and a full moon, unaware of a small ship following them. Unbeknownst to the Allied forces, the small ship was the Japanese destroyer Fubuki, part of a convoy with 56 transports heading for West Java's Bantam Bay. Accompanying them were 4 heavy cruisers armed with deadly long-lance torpedoes, outranging those on Perth, and a light cruiser, Notori, also equipped with long-lance torpedoes. The Japanese ships, manned by well-trained crews experienced in night fighting, were under the command of Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita, with a mission to land Lieutenant General Hitoshi Inamura's 16th Army at Bantam Bay for the conquest of Java. The cruisers were alarmed when a lookout on Perth spotted an unidentified ship. Perth signaled using their Aldis lamp, but the unknown ship responded with 2 green lamps, not following the Allied night recognition signal. The mystery ship, later identified as the Japanese destroyer Harukaze, escorting the transports, heeled away, emitting smoke and revealing its full silhouette. The Japanese destroyer launched a red flare to alert its fleet. Houston's alarm bells rang, calling the crew to general quarters. As the fleeing Allied cruisers passed Babi Island, they unexpectedly found themselves amid a vast Japanese convoy surrounded by 27 transports. The Mogami-class heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, Nagara-class light cruiser Notori, and 7 destroyers, all under the command of Rear Admiral Kenzaburo Hara. These lay dispersed to the northwest. Hara mistakenly believed the fleeing cruisers were heading in the opposite direction, failing to guard the transports, their primary mission. The Japanese neglected to intercept Perth and Houston, allowing the Allied ships to slip by Fubuki, which issued a warning too late. Panic broke out amidst the Japanese ranks as ships to the west scrambled to take their position and prepare for battle. Japanese Admiral Kurita held back his cruisers and destroyers, leaving the chaotic battle to Hara. The 2 battered cruisers engaged 27 vulnerable transports, sailing to the west with their guns blazing. The Hatakazi and Harukazi sailed northwest, laying a smokescreen in an attempt to hide the transport ships. Amphibious landings were the most vulnerable situation for the transports. However, the scarcity of Allied forces, the exhausted crews, and depleted ammunition hindered their potential success in exploiting this advantageous situation. Initially, the Fubuki was the only vessel attempting to block the Allied ships, trailing them at a distance. The damage sustained to Houston's turret during previous aerial raids meant the heavy cruiser couldn't shell Fubuki when the Japanese destroyer launched torpedoes at 11:14 p.m. The torpedoes missed their targets and Fubuki retreated behind a smokescreen. Intent on escaping through Sunda Strait, the cruisers maneuvered to unmask their batteries against the transports. Then, the destroyer Hatakazi came in range and opened fire. Within 10 minutes, most of the Japanese ships appeared and opened fire. The ensuing battle became a chaotic melee under the full moon, with Japanese destroyers attacking the Allied cruisers from their starboard sides. Harukazi and Perth suffered hits in various areas, with casualties reported. In an attempt to avoid the barrage, Houston and Perth turned to the northwest, sheltering their starboard side with Panjang Island. As Japanese destroyers attacked in groups, Waller skillfully navigated Perth, employing salvo-chasing tactics. Japanese ships attempted another torpedo attack, but their torpedoes, set at a lower depth, missed the Allied cruisers, with the Japanese mistakenly believing they were engaging battleships. In a last desperate effort, the Allied cruisers engaged the overwhelming Japanese forces. Despite being surrounded and running out of ammunition, the cruisers fought bravely against the Japanese convoy, including heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Amidst the smoke and chaos, the Mogami launched torpedoes hitting their own transport ships. 4 transport ships were hit, sinking to the depths of the sea. Among these transport ships was the Sakura Maru, with General Imamura on board. The explosion threw him in the oil-polluted water. As the Japanese destroyers closed in, the exhausted Allied crews continued firing. At 11:42 p.m., Perth suffered torpedo hits and began sinking, with Captain Hector Waller refusing to abandon ship. The Australian cruiser went down 45 minutes later, taking a significant number of sailors with her. Meanwhile, USS Houston, witnessing Perth's demise, turned to confront the Japanese forces, engaging in a brave but ultimately futile fight. She'd been hit several times by shells and torpedoes. Houston used every available weapon, including a Marine shooting out a searchlight with his rifle. In a renewed barrage, the Japanese cruisers Mikuma and Mogumi targeted USS Houston, hitting the aft engine room and wardroom. The latter, doubling as a dressing station for wounded men, suffered casualties from ruptured steam lines. Another shell struck a turret's faceplate, causing sparks that forced Captain Rooks to flood the forward magazines to prevent an explosion. With both forward turrets now silent, Rooks relied on the secondary 5-inch guns, engaging the Japanese at point-blank range. A Japanese torpedo struck Houston on the starboard side under the bridge, sealing her fate. In the armoured conning tower, Rooks, fatally wounded by shrapnel, instructed Marine bugler Jack Lee to sound abandon ship. With the captain's death imminent, Executive Officer Commander David Roberts took command of the ship, now burning and heeling. Despite Houston's inevitable sinking, the Japanese fired torpedoes until 12:29. As the cruiser rolled to starboard and plunged beneath the waves, Roberts, fearing not all had heard the order, instructed signalman William Stafford to sound abandon ship once more. A poignant final note as Houston sank. Captain Rooks perished with his ship. As the Houston was sinking, a sudden explosion among the troop ships shocked the Japanese. A minesweeper was hit by a torpedo, leading to an enormous explosion and its subsequent sinking. Amidst the wreckage of the USS Houston, there were 368 survivors, including the ship's chaplain, Commander George Rents, who, a year shy of retirement, sacrificed himself by jumping off his raft, giving his life jacket to a younger shipmate, and offering a prayer before swimming off to his unseen fate. Rents was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his selfless act. In total, over 1,000 Allied troops were killed. 675 were captured. The Japanese lost 1 mine layer, 4 transport ships, and suffered damage to 1 cruiser and 3 destroyers. Their troop losses were light, with 10 killed and 37 wounded. Another survivor, General Inamura, spent time floating in the water on a piece of wood before reaching Bantam Bay. A Japanese Navy officer apologized to Inamura for sinking his ships, but the general, showing chivalry, replied, "Let Houston have the credit." The Dutch Admiral-class destroyer Evertsen had left port at Chilotjap 2 hours after Houston and Perth. Noticing the battle from a distance, she attempted to join the fight while evading the main Japanese force. However, she was no match for the Japanese flotilla, and 2 Fubuki-class destroyers engaged her, leading to its crew grounding Evertsen on a reef. The surviving crew surrendered to the Japanese over a week later. The fall of Singapore, Bangka and Java, coupled with the successful overland march to capture Rangoon and the strategic acquisition of Andaman, Nicobar and Sumatra by the Japanese, solidified the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, necessitating protective measures for the newly acquired territories. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.